All right, strap in, everybody. Today we are going deep on a topic that's not just, well, fascinating, but also incredibly relevant to, to everyone, really. India's foreign policy.
You got it.
Whether you're, prepping for the UPSC, looking for that edge, or just someone who wants to get, like, a better grasp on India's place in the world, this deep dive's for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we've got a whole stack of sources ready to break down just how this nation, with this amazing history and this unique perspective, navigates on that global stage.
It's fascinating, really. What I find so interesting about India's foreign policy, it's not just some document sitting in a file cabinet somewhere.
Right.
It really is a reflection of India, like, as a whole. It's geography, history, it's like its very soul.
Yeah, it's like trying to understand a person.
Yes.
You can't just look at what they do. You have to kind of, understand their past, their experiences, their values, right?
Yeah, exactly. And in India's case, you can trace those values like all the way back to their constitution. Article 51, it specifically talks about the pursuit of international peace and security.
Wow.
It's like a directive principle, it's a fundamental goal.
Wow. So it's not just like an aspiration. It's literally, it's woven into the nation, like from the very beginning.
It is. And that commitment to peace, that's really the bedrock of all those core principles that have guided India's foreign policy, like, since independence.
Okay, let's get into those principles.
Uh-huh.
First up, promotion of world peace. But it's not just peace for peace's sake, is it?
No, not at all. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister,
Right.
he actually called it an emergent necessity.
Interesting.
Yeah, he argued that peace is actually, like, it's a prerequisite for a nation to actually develop.
You can't build anything if you're, constantly in conflict.
Exactly. Without it, you can't really achieve much else. And this principle really dovetails with another core value, anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism.
Of course, I mean, you think about India's history with British rule,
Mm-hmm.
it's not surprising at all that they would be strong champions of nations' right to self-determination.
Absolutely, yeah. And, this experience of being colonized kind of fueled this sense of solidarity with these, like, liberation movements all across Asia and Africa. India has consistently opposed, the exploitation of weaker nations.
Right. And that commitment to equality, it's beyond just political freedom, right? Like, what about their stance on racial discrimination?
That's a crucial part of their foreign policy. I mean, India's, like, opposition to apartheid in South Africa, that's a really powerful example of their commitment to equality on the, world stage.
Absolutely. Okay, let's talk about a term that's, I think, familiar to anybody studying international relations, especially our UPSC folks, non-alignment.
Non-alignment, yes. This is an interesting one. During the Cold War, when the world was pretty much divided between, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, India chose a different path.
They didn't want to pick a side.
Exactly. They didn't want to pick a side. They wanted to forge their own independent course. And Nehru actually warned against getting caught up in the power politics of groups and the dangers of aligning with nations, driven by fear.
Wow.
Instead, India, they championed this idea of cooperation and peaceful coexistence. And it didn't matter, like, what ideology a country followed.
Yeah, so in a world where, like, everybody was choosing teams, India was like, nah, we're going to do our own thing.
Exactly. It was a bold move, to say the least. And it really shaped India's foreign policy, like, for decades. It also led to the development of something called Panchsheel.
Ah, Panchsheel, the famous 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. It's almost like India's, like, diplomatic commandments.
Yes, precisely. And they're surprisingly straightforward, Mutual respect for each other's territory, sovereignty, non-aggression, non-interference in each other's internal affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence.
It's so simple, yet so profound at the same time.
It really is. What's amazing is Panchsheel wasn't just some internal document, It was embraced by a whole bunch of other countries. It became this cornerstone of international diplomacy.
That's impressive. But how do those principles translate into action? Like, what are India's key objectives on the world stage?
Okay, so that's where it gets really interesting for anyone who's trying to understand how India actually operates, out there in the world. At the end of the day, it all comes down to protecting their national interests.
Okay, that sounds pretty straightforward.
Mm.
But what does that mean, like, in the context of their foreign policy?
Well, it's about, ensuring India's security, both internal and external. It's about fostering economic growth, development, and it's about promoting India's standing on the world stage, their
Mm.
voice, their influence, their values.
Okay, so it's about like creating the right environment for India to like thrive.
Exactly, exactly. And a big part of that is focusing on their immediate neighborhood.
Right. We can't talk about India's foreign policy without talking about their relationships with their neighbors, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. And this is where the Gujral Doctrine comes in. This doctrine was articulated by former Prime Minister I.K. Gujral, and it's all about fostering regional stability. It's about building strong relationships, with those neighboring countries,
Okay.
especially the smaller ones.
So it's about being the good neighbor.
Well, it's a little bit more nuanced than that. It's about taking the lead, in creating this peaceful and stable region
Got it.
by extending concessions to their smaller neighbors without actually demanding anything in return.
So it's about playing the long game,
Right.
recognizing that a stable neighborhood, it's good for everyone.
Exactly. And that long-term vision, it's also reflected in India's Act East policy.
Yes.
This marks a big shift toward, deeper engagement with the Asia-Pacific region.
Right. This is huge, especially for
Yeah.
the UPSC folks out there. It started as Look East, but it's become much more proactive. Act East.
Yeah, it's not just about observing the region anymore. It's about, active participation. It's about forging economic partnerships, strengthening those political ties, even collaborating on, security issues.
So why is this shift so important for India?
Well, the Asia-Pacific region, it's incredibly dynamic. It has this booming economy, and its geopolitical importance is growing all the time. Engaging with this region, it's vital for India's economic development,
Yeah.
and it's vital for their strategic position in the world, really.
Okay, so it's about like partnerships, it's about trade, it's about security cooperation, it's the whole package.
It is. It's about seizing opportunities, building a strong presence in a region that's really crucial to India's future. And it's not just about looking east either. India also has a policy focused on connecting with Central Asia.
Oh, so it's not just East, it's Central Asia too. Tell us about that. What's their strategy there?
So the Connect Central Asia policy, it's all about forging closer ties with countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan.
What's driving that focus on Central Asia?
Well, Central Asia is incredibly rich in resources, strategically located, and it offers a lot of potential for collaboration in areas like energy, trade, and even counterterrorism. It's a region that's becoming increasingly important on the global stage.
Now, let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about a topic that's often, surrounded by some sensitivity, India's nuclear doctrine.
Yeah, this one always sparks, a lot of discussion and debate. India's nuclear doctrine, it's based on this no first use policy.
So they're saying they'll only use nuclear weapons in retaliation if someone, nukes them first, basically.
Yeah.
Attacks their territory or forces.
That's right, precisely. It's all about deterrence.
Showing that any, nuclear aggression is going to be met with a devastating response. But isn't there a risk that things could escalate really quickly in a tense situation?
That's why India has this really tightly controlled command structure.
Okay.
The Nuclear Command Authority, they're at the helm. This authority has the sole responsibility for making any decisions about using nuclear weapons.
Right. So it's a very deliberate and controlled system.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to remember that India didn't just, wake up one morning and decide to develop nuclear weapons. There's a historical context here, right? Like
Yeah.
a security environment that led them to make this choice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Understanding why India felt it needed to develop nuclear weapons, I mean, that's essential to grasping their foreign policy choices.
For sure. So we've got this focus on regional engagement, the Gujral Doctrine, the Act East policy, the Connect Central Asia policy. But does that mean India's turning inwards? Like, are they becoming isolationists?
Not at all. India is very actively engaged on the global stage. I mean, they're playing a really prominent role in the United Nations, and they're advocating for, a multipolar world order.
Okay, hold on. Before we go any further, I think we need to define multipolar world order for our listeners who might not be familiar with that term.
All right, good point. It basically means moving away from a world that's dominated by a single superpower or, a small group of powerful nations.
Okay.
It's about, a more diffuse distribution of power where multiple countries and regional blocs, they have a say in shaping global affairs.
So instead of one or two big players calling all the shots, it's about a more collaborative and balanced approach to like world governance.
Exactly. And India believes that this kind of like multipolar world is better, it's more conducive to peace, stability, and development for everybody.
Yeah, it's about leveling the playing field a bit, giving more countries a voice, creating like a more inclusive system.
Exactly, exactly. And India is actively working towards this goal through their participation in those like multilateral forums, their advocacy for, global nuclear disarmament, and their push for, well, this is something our UPSC folks will definitely want to pay attention to.
You're talking about their bid for a permanent seat on the UN Security Council.
That's the one. It's a long-standing goal for India, and it really reflects their ambition to play a more like prominent role in shaping global decisions.
But it's not like an easy thing to do, right?
Mm.
There's a lot of competition, a lot of political maneuvering involved.
Yeah, it's a complicated dance,
Yeah.
involving negotiations, alliances, navigating the often choppy waters of global power
That
dynamics.
sounds like a recipe for intrigue.
Definitely. The pursuit of a permanent seat on the Security Council, I mean, that's a fascinating case study in international relations, and one that really highlights India's growing aspirations.
It's about having a seat at the table where the big decisions are made.
Absolutely. It's about having a voice, having influence, and being able to shape that global agenda in a way that, reflects India's interests and values.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From the historical foundations to the core principles to the key objectives. It's clear that India's foreign policy, it's multi-layered and dynamic.
It is, and we're just getting started. There's so much more to explore, like the specific challenges that they face, the complexities of, their relationships with specific countries,
Yeah.
and the potential future, like, directions of their foreign policy.
And speaking of challenges, things are rarely smooth sailing in the world of diplomacy.
No.
So let's get into some of those contemporary issues that India is grappling with right now.
Good idea. Because, while India has made like these remarkable strides in their foreign policy, they still face a number of hurdles in today's, complex and rapidly changing world.
Right, right. I mean, for starters, terrorism, that comes to mind immediately. It's a constant threat. It requires vigilance and international cooperation.
Absolutely. And then you've got these unresolved border disputes with neighbors like Pakistan and China,
Yeah.
adding another layer of complexity. These disputes, they require this careful blend of diplomacy and military preparedness.
And then, of course, there's the rise of China, a powerful neighbor with their own ambitions and interests in the region.
Yeah.
This adds a whole new dimension to the geopolitical chessboard.
It does, it does. The evolving relationship between India and China, I mean, that's one of the most significant geopolitical developments of our time, really. It's this mix of competition and cooperation. Requires a really delicate balancing act.
So how is India navigating this challenging landscape? What strategies are they using to deal with these issues?
Well, they're not relying on like a single approach. It's multi-pronged. It involves strengthening their military capabilities, deepening those strategic partnerships with countries like the U.S., Japan, and Australia, and staying active in multilateral forums like the UN and the G20.
So it's a mix of hard power, diplomacy, and global engagement.
Exactly. India's foreign policy, it's constantly evolving as they, adapt to new challenges and opportunities. It's dynamic. You need agility. You need foresight. You need a really sharp understanding of global power dynamics.
And as that global landscape, as it keeps shifting, what potential future developments might we see on the horizon? And how could those impact India's role in the world?
That's a great question. One that really, takes us into the realm of speculation and strategic foresight.
Well, let's hold that thought for a moment, because I think it's time to shift our focus to the future of Indian foreign policy and what that might hold.
So as we look ahead, one of the most striking trends is the rise of Asia on the global stage. And India, with that growing economy and its strategic location, they're really poised to play a key role in this Asian century.
It's like they're at the heart of this massive shift in global power.
Yeah.
But what are some specific developments that we should keep an eye on?
Well, for starters, India's economic growth, it's expected to keep going up.
Wow.
They could potentially become, one of the top 3 economies in the world in the coming decades.
Yeah, that's some serious economic muscle. But how does that translate into, geopolitical influence?
Well, think of it this way. As India's economy keeps growing, so does their need for, for resources, for markets, for technological partnerships. And that naturally leads to deeper engagement with other countries, especially in Asia and Africa.
So it's not just about economic growth for its own sake. It's about using that growth to strengthen their position in the world.
Exactly, exactly. And let's not forget, the elephant or maybe the dragon in the room, China.
Right.
The relationship between India and China, I mean, that's one of the most important in the world today.
It's a relationship that's full of complexities, right? I mean, on one hand, you've got these two major Asian powers with a lot of shared interests, and on the other hand, you've got this history of border disputes, strategic rivalry.
Yeah, it's a really delicate dance. It's a balancing act between cooperation, competition. There's potential for them to work together on issues like climate change, trade, but there's also that potential for friction, over those border disputes and regional influence.
So how can India manage this relationship effectively?
It takes a really nuanced approach. India needs to use their partnerships with other countries like the US, Japan, Australia to balance China's growing power. At the same time, they need to find those areas where they have things in common, where they can work together,
Yeah.
where cooperation would be, good for both sides.
So it's like walking a tightrope.
Right.
Maintaining that stability while also advancing your own interests.
That's a good metaphor.
Yeah.
It highlights how India's foreign policy it's becoming increasingly sophisticated. It's multifaceted. It combines economic engagement, military strength and skillful diplomacy.
Okay, let's zoom out from the specifics of the Asia-Pacific region for a second and consider that broader global landscape. What other trends are out there, shaping the future of international relations? How might those affect India's foreign policy?
Well, one of the most significant trends is this shift towards a multipolar world order. We touched on this a bit earlier, but it's worth revisiting. We're moving away from a world that's dominated by a single superpower or, just a handful of powerful nations.
So it's about power becoming more diffuse, more spread out among different countries and regional blocs.
Exactly, exactly. And this presents both challenges and opportunities for India.
All right. Challenges in the sense that it's a more complicated world, right? Yeah. Harder to predict. But opportunities in the sense that India has more room to maneuver, to assert their own interests.
You got it. In this multipolar world, India's ability to build those strong partnerships, to navigate these competing interests, and to project their own values, their vision, that's going to be crucial. It's going to be crucial to their success.
Yeah, it's about being more than just a player in the game. It's about becoming a rule maker, shaping the rules of the game itself.
Exactly. They're not content to just sit back and react to what's happening in the world. They want to be a proactive force,
Right.
driving the conversation, setting the agenda.
It's an ambitious goal,
Yeah.
but considering, their growing economic might, their diplomatic skills, their commitment to those principles like peace and multilateralism, it seems like they're well positioned to make a real impact.
I agree. I agree. And there's another trend we should consider here, one that's transforming almost every aspect of our lives, the rise of technology.
The digital age is here, and it's changing everything. But how does that impact India's foreign policy specifically?
It's a game changer. Technological advances, they're reshaping global trade, security. They're even changing how diplomacy is done. Think about things like cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, space exploration. I mean, these are all becoming increasingly important, in international relations.
It's like a whole new set of tools in the diplomatic toolbox.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And those tools, they're constantly evolving, which means nations have to be adaptable, innovative, in their approach to foreign policy.
So how's India doing in this new technological landscape?
Well, India, they've got this booming tech sector and a young tech-savvy population.
Right.
They're already making progress in areas like software development, digital services, space exploration.
Yeah.
But to really thrive, in this new era, they need to keep investing in innovation, keep developing their technological capabilities.
It's about staying ahead of the curve, embracing these new technologies and using them to advance their interests out there on the world stage.
Precisely. Precisely. And it's not just about, the hard technology itself. It's also about understanding the social, economic, and political implications of these advances.
It's about thinking strategically, anticipating those challenges, those opportunities that these new technologies present, and developing policies that ensure they're being used for good.
Well said. Well said. And I think this is a good point to circle back to our UPSC folks out there. We've covered a lot, from historical foundations to future trends. So what are the key takeaways, the things they really need to grasp as they're preparing for these exams?
Yeah, let's distill this down to what's most important for them.
Okay, so first and foremost, it's crucial to understand that India's foreign policy, it's not static.
Right.
It's always evolving in
Right.
response to, domestic priorities and that changing global landscape we've been talking about.
So it's not about just memorizing facts and figures.
Yeah.
It's about understanding the dynamics, the principles, the forces that are shaping India's actions on that world stage.
Exactly. And another key point is that India's foreign policy, it's fundamentally driven by their national interests.
Okay.
This overarching goal, that's what guides their interactions with other nations, their participation in, international organizations, their approach to global challenges.
Okay, that makes sense. But isn't national interest a bit of a loaded term? I mean, it can be interpreted in so many different ways.
You're right. It's not always, perfectly clear cut. But in the context of Indian foreign policy, it's about ensuring their security. It's about promoting their economic development. It's about enhancing their standing in the world.
So it's about protecting their interests, but it's also about something more than that.
Right.
We talked about those core principles: peace, non-alignment, anti-colonialism, multilateralism. Those play a role too, don't they?
They do. Absolutely. These principles, they're not just, empty slogans. They're woven into the fabric of India's foreign policy. They're like a moral compass, a framework for making decisions, and a way for India to project their values, their vision to the rest of the world.
It's like they're saying, look, we're pursuing our own interests, but we're doing it in a way that's consistent with our values, with our vision for a better world.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And that's what makes India's foreign policy so interesting to study. It's this mix of pragmatism and idealism, of self-interest and global responsibility.
It's a complex balancing act.
It is. And for those UPSC aspirants, it's not enough to just know the what of India's foreign policy. They need to understand the why.
Yeah.
They need to be able to analyze those policy choices, to assess how effective they are, to really articulate what the implications are for India's role in the world.
So it's about developing that critical thinking, that ability to see that big picture, to connect the dots between history, ideology, and real-world diplomacy.
Exactly. And that brings us to a really crucial point. This deep dive, it's just a starting point for our listeners, especially those preparing for those UPSC exams, the real learning, it starts now.
It's about taking this foundation we've laid and building on it.
Right.
Staying engaged with what's happening in the world, analyzing those foreign policy decisions in real time, thinking critically about the challenges and the opportunities that are out there.
Precisely. The world of diplomacy, it's constantly in motion. To really understand Indian foreign policy, you have to stay informed, stay curious, stay engaged.
So what are some resources, strategies that our listeners can use to keep learning, to deepen their understanding of Indian foreign policy?
Well, there are a ton of great resources out there. Following reputable news sources that cover, international affairs is definitely a must. The Ministry of External Affairs website, that's a gold mine. It's got a ton of information on India's foreign policy positions and all their initiatives.
And don't forget about think tanks and academic journals.
Yeah.
They offer some really in-depth analysis and research on all these different aspects of Indian foreign policy.
Absolutely. Engaging with those kinds of resources, that's going to help you develop a much more, a nuanced perspective, a well-informed perspective. And here's something else that I think is really helpful. Don't just read passively, Take notes, highlight the important stuff, and then try to connect what you're learning to what's happening in the world right now.
That's such great advice. It's about really getting involved with the material, making it your own, and don't be afraid to to question your own assumptions, right?
Hmm.
Look for different perspectives. Consider those alternative viewpoints.
Exactly, exactly. The more you dig into the material, the deeper your understanding is going to become.
Well, this deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like even I've learned so much. But before we wrap up, I've got one final question for you, and I think this one's really key for our UPSC folks out there.
Okay, shoot.
Given everything we've talked about, the historical context, the core principles, the
Yeah.
challenge, all those potential future developments, what's the one thing you really want our listeners to remember about Indian foreign policy?
Hmm. That's a great question. I think the most important thing is that India's foreign policy, it's a journey, not a destination.
Okay.
It's constantly evolving, and it's shaped by all these factors, both internal and external.
So it's not about memorizing a list of facts or policies. It's about understanding the how and the why,
Yeah.
the things that drive the process.
Precisely, precisely. It's about developing this nuanced understanding of India's, place in the world, their aspirations, their challenges, and their role in shaping a global order that's more just, more equitable, and sustainable.
That, my friends, is the essence of Indian foreign policy.
Well said.
Well, it's been an incredible journey exploring all the ins and outs of India's approach to the world stage. We hope this deep dive has given you a solid understanding of the principles, the objectives, and the challenges that shape their foreign policy.
We've only just scratched the surface, but hopefully we've sparked some curiosity, that desire to really dig in and learn more about this fascinating subject.
And for all those UPSC aspirants out there, remember, this is just the beginning. Keep learning, stay informed, and develop your own insights into this dynamic and ever-changing field. Your understanding of India's foreign policy, that's going to be a huge asset in your journey towards those coveted exams.
And to all our listeners, whether you're students, professionals, or just curious citizens, remember that foreign policy, it's not just for diplomats and policymakers. It affects all of us. It shapes the world we live in. So stay engaged, keep asking questions, and be part of the conversation.
Because at the end of the day, India's foreign policy, like the foreign policy of any nation, it reflects its people, their values, their hopes for the future.
Well said. Well said. And on that note, we encourage you to keep exploring this fascinating subject. Stay curious, stay engaged, never stop learning.
That's a wrap on our deep dive into Indian foreign policy. We hope you enjoyed the journey. We'll catch you next time for another insightful exploration.